It's the weekly blog, week 18. Wow, those numbers are starting to get up there. Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? Snowballs. You start off doing this thing thinking it's going to be, oh, geez, it's only week four. It's going, how long is this going, it's incredible how time flies once you get into it. So, where are we at? Not a huge amount to report since last week. Things progress continuously. So, I hit up my LinkedIn network, which I'd sort of accidentally been cultivating for nigh on 20 years at this point. Weird thing. Again, weird professional skill of mine that I don't know where it came from. I'm very good at the networking and very good at just annoying people until they help. Not to say people have been reluctant. They've been incredibly helpful. We've got a few good connections already going on. Turns out there's the cybersecurity space is relevant here. Makes sense, doesn't it? Strayed myself into a conference, two people sitting right next to each other who both got in touch over in Canada at a cyber warfare convention, who were actually at the convention at the time when they both got LinkedIn post messages from me, which is pretty funny. LinkedIn really does encourage complete shamelessness. It's kind of like dating, doesn't it? Anyway, is what it is. So we're off to a good start there. So we're starting to get an idea. The overwhelming feedback is that there isn't any. Like, so the question that what I'm currently looking for right now is examples of agentic AI use in counter violent extremism work, which is the standard term for counter extremism work in social media. So, well, social media online in general. So the thing is there's not a lot. Um, we're looking at new technology. Well, relative, it's funny, right? So I say new technology. This whole situation is very, very borderline, which is interesting. So agentic AI is new, but it's only new from a governance perspective. It's not new from a deployment perspective. It's basically what people are talking about when they talk about AI. So Claude, Grok, all of these things are moving into agentic models. And because again, with tech, there's no limit to just pushing it out because it's a capitalist initiative, right? Like you push it out, you want to get ahead of the competition, you want to get your product to market fastest and improve it while it's out there. It's standard technology stuff. Same thing happens with phones, same thing happens with all sorts of platforms. Same thing happened with all these like Zoom and Teams and everything like that during the pandemic. Skype got outpaced. That was pretty funny in a vaguely sad kind of way, but either way. So it's been deployed incredibly rapidly. While there is still absolutely no research about its implications or its governance for that matter. So the broad result of that is that there is almost definitely uses of agentic AI taking place for CVE, counter violent extremist work, but it's in-house right now. And that's the feedback I'm largely getting from the LinkedIn networks. And that's a problem because if it's not published in an academic journal, we don't have any authoritative sources on it. Two, if it's in-house, then it's probably subject to confidentiality issues and because of commercial and confidence, right? Like people want to be able to make money off this and you can't give away details of how it's working because then your competitors will get up on it. There's also a security function to it in that sense as well, I suppose, in the sense that if the people you're trying to counter the extremists you're trying to counter, find out about how the system works, then they can start working around it as well, though that's probably a smaller factor to all of this. Simple fact of the matter is the technology is moving so fast that all of your authoritative governance systems just aren't keeping up. Turns out the EU's just passed some legislation, so that's the first of its kind. Leave it to the EU to do that on good quality AI. Naturally, it's voluntary because it has to be, because, good luck regulating them otherwise. They just all sit in the US, which is chronically unregulated, and they'll just do whatever they want, like, much like the social media companies. But it is collaborative, so it sets a good baseline. Um, so yeah, we continue to hunt. I made a couple of connections, and there's some experimental projects underway. But the long and short of it is that anything I learn about it, it's going to have to stay in my head for the meantime. This is not formal data gathering. We're still pre-confirmation, so we haven't even nailed the research question yet. This is mostly just about finding out the state of play of the field, so that the research question question can accurately reflect that. And so the real risk right now is that if agentic AI isn't being used for CVE work at all, and there's a good reason for that, then basing my research question around agentic AI use for CVE work would not be a good idea. So I don't think that's the case. I think it's definitely underway, and I think it's going to be increasingly used in the future. Everyone I've spoken to, there's a pretty standard script I get back, which is along the lines of not aware of anything. Definitely a good idea to be looking into it, though. So we're ahead of the curve here, which is exactly where we want to be. That's really, really good news, both from a value of the PhD perspective and future job employment prospects for me. So, I'm not gonna lie, it's part of the thinking. So there's that. The other thing that's happened recently, which it hasn't really, I mean, I'm still in the air whether or not it's going to affect me here. I'm still tossing up one of the questions that I need to narrow down, and one of the variables that need to get narrowed down on was which extremist group are we going to focus on? Because I do need to focus on one just for the sake of measurability. Thank you again, Matteo, for helping me narrow my research question. Originally, I was going to focus on NSNs or the neo-Nazis. And that may still be the case, but something interesting has happened with them recently, which is that the federal government, no less, has regulated them. Last week, they've officially been regulated. They're no longer allowed to exist as a political party, and membership or any other sort of input or association with them can lead to a 7-year jail term. Now, the whole PhD is built around security versus freedom, right? The paradox of tolerance and all this sort of thing. So, am I upset in any way whatsoever about the friggin' neo-Nazis getting regulated? Absolutely not. There's a lot less constructive ways I could think of doing it, but at the same time, one does need to look for the edge cases in any sort of governance. That's my entire field, right? Looking for how a system can be abused so that it can't be abused, so that can be patched. And there's an excellent video from the Constitutional Clarion, which I'll chuck into the chat. Or what do you call it? Into the description below this video. That outlines it extremely clearly how the bit of legislation that's been used. This is the hate speech legislation. Well, no, no, not hate speech. Let's just say either way. There's a relatively new bit of legislation that came through after the Bondo shootings. They keep changing the scope and the way they deploy this. It's not good. It's very, very bad. It's been used to a good outcome here, but the thing is that always the test is that if someone got in that you disagreed with, who was malicious, how would they use this legislation? The long and short of it, watch the video. It goes into a lot more detail than I do, but the long and short of it is the only thing that is required for this, the only test that is required to ban a political party using this bit of regulation is that the minister is satisfied that they have or will historically or going forward enabled or participated in hate crime, which is fine on paper. In reality, because if you move the proper definition of hate crime and all that sort of thing, then yeah, that's probably not that bad. However, there is no definition. At least none that they're actually held accountable to. There are definitions, but the point is that the minister can just say, "Yes, I'm satisfied," and it goes in. There's no need for it to go through Parliament. There's no need for it to go through the courts. There's no substantive test. It's just that the minister, and the AG who was appointed by the minister or the government, is satisfied. Massively open to abuse. I mean, massively open to abuse. If One Nation got in, they'd ban all sorts instantly. Of course they would. It's what they do. Yeah, so that is a problem. It also illustrates the need for the work I'm doing. Because when we talk about a solid ethical framework, it's the exact opposite of what I just described. That is an absence of an ethical framework, or more to the point, it relies entirely on the judgment and uh, integrity of the minister, which is variable at the best of times. So any powerful party, as always with the power dynamics work, any party that is not materially and personally accountable for their decision making proportionate to the amount of power they have over others is not accountable. And that's exactly what's happening with the minister. So, case in point, if the minister decided that they were going to ban a political party just because, just for completely unjustifiable reasons, nothing can be done to hold them accountable. Apart from voting out the government at the like they can't be charged. It's not illegal. They wrote the law. They can't be challenged. They can be challenged in the High Court, which is currently happening, unfortunately, by the NSNs. And I will be shocked if that law comes through in one piece because it's terrible. Almost certainly won't pass the. There's several challenges to it, but it almost certainly will be challenged on the. Well, it is being challenged on the implied freedom of speech. And as we've said before, the test for that is surprisingly comprehensive. I'll be shocked if it gets past that. The head of power one's interesting too. Do they actually have the authority to do this? Probably not, but I'm not a lawyer. Either way, check out that video below. It's very, very good. Yeah, so that leads us to a nasty situation. So look, the worst thing that can happen is that you put a law in or an ethical code or whatever that bans, that interferes with legitimate political speech. The second worst thing you can do is you put a framework forward that accidentally inhibits political speech with a good intention, and then it gets rejected because you rarely get a second go at that. That's obviously two major barriers that I want to avoid. What we're looking at putting through is something comprehensive and defensible down to a T, which is also part of the reason why, apart from the fact that I have no influence over the government enough to get legislation through, we don't really want to do legislation here or regulation. It's more of a policy stance. It needs to be careful and strategic because the government implying an ethical code comes back to that same point. Who gets held accountable for it? Tough space, even if I did have influence and power. So we continue. What we're looking for here, look, this is sort of not new, at least in my estimation. You sort of see this happen a lot. You get a new innovation come through. Drones is always my go-to with this. You remember when drones suddenly went from being high-end military technology, like the Predator drone stuff, to suddenly you could buy one for $20 down at JB Hi-Fi? That was weird, right? I'm not still not entirely sure exactly what led to that leap in technology, but it happened, and that was about 15 years ago or so. And what happens? It goes from your standard technology adoption curve. You got your early adopters, your geeks, and your technologists who are doing it purely for the love of the game. But if it's viable, you see an adoption by the mainstream. If it can jump that gap, and then there's always people that are going to hold out, but so on and so forth. But jumping that gap is the real trick, and there's not just the question of popularity. There's a question of profitability. Drones definitely passed that one. Drones, suddenly there was all these cottage industries. You saw people taking wedding photos with the drones. You saw people doing all sorts of stuff with the drones. It was, advertising on drones going up and down the beach. It was gross, but it was a thing because it was possible, it was novel, and it was profitable. So of course it happened. But the bigger challenge is often governance. And that's not to say that, oh, the government's going to ban it straight away. No, the government doesn't give a damn. As long as it's not interfering with their business, they'll happily let a free market take off. However, that assumes that the technology doesn't start causing some major, major problems, and drones did. We started off with privacy violations because, of course, that was possible. And so it started happening. Fringe cases for the most part, but it was entirely possible. I mean, if a drone, there was that classic one over in the US where a drone came over someone's fence and started spying on someone's daughter sunbaking in the backyard, massive privacy violation. Guy goes out and shoots it out of the air with a shotgun, doesn't he? He ended up getting charged with illegal discharge of a firearm, which is, I didn't even know they had that law in the US, but there you go. But he did not get charged with destruction of the property because it was invading his property, if I remember the story correctly. But that was an interesting French case because it was the first time it had happened, and it had no governance around it. Because why would there be governance around someone flying a small aeronautical object over with a camera attached to it over your fence? Prior to this technology, it would have been a helicopter, which is slightly more regulated. So there was that, but then there was the even bigger issue when people started flying these drones into restricted airspace and airports, at which point the government went, that's it, you're done. That's enough of that. And in Australia, at least, they did what they do, which is they came down with the regulation hammer. And it is now the standard in Australia that you can only fly drones in designated public spaces, which is usually a sports oval, which you will notice immediately kills like 90% of their commercial uses. The exception, you can still use it for business purposes, but you need a light aircraft license. In other words, not happening. Unless you're really, really into it and there's a decent profit margin attached to it, the whole industry died, right? I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, just saying it's a good example of how it didn't make that leap. Now, AI is struggling right now. It has seen far wider adoption, I should say, into all sorts of industries, and just including the government, to the point where I'll be absolutely shocked if it goes away to some degree. It would need a pretty catastrophic collapse for it to go away at this point, and it is useful, but we have a governance problem. Once again, and it hasn't made that leap because the technology naturally massively outpaces the governance. And in large part because the governance can't really emerge until the problems start to emerge. So we haven't had our crisis yet with AI. It's lining up though. We've got Palantir, we've got all sorts that are working on like trying to come up with rationalizations or supervillain manifestos on why massive intrusive privacy violation by AI on a daily basis is actually a good thing. So whole thing's the same as drones. It's just a hell of a lot scaled up. So what we're doing here, and inevitably with the governance thing, if it does make it over that hump, you go from very simple regulation or very ineffective regulation to or very heavy over the top regulation. And then sort of spiral in towards a sophisticated standard. Something that both reflects practical reality, but also sufficiently high standards that it allows it to function in a market economy, functional, basically. Crypto never made that jump. It's been marginalized to a penny stock functionally. They never made the functional jump to something mainstream. Similarly, uh, oh, NFTs, man, I always forget those existed. Never even made the jump to a penny stock. It's just not a thing. Social media, on the other hand, did. It's still circling around its own problems, but it's sufficiently on everyone's radar now, and people are sufficiently jaded by its various abuses over time that it's racking up some governance, if only informally. People engage with social media very differently to how they used to because they don't trust it anymore. So anyway, that's a long round about technology and technology ethics, but yeah, it's inevitable. Always this stuff outpaces. Oh, did I say week 17 at the start of this? Week 18? Whatever. I'm not re-recording this. So yeah, what we're trying to do is get ahead of the curve, and I'm under no illusions I'm going to solve this problem like on a practical level. It's not like everyone's going to read my bit, no, someone's going to read my PhD and actually adopt it, but it's a template. So when the problem does reach sufficient criticality that it needs a solution, there will be a template that already exists for it. If I get super lucky, we might push it out as government policy in one state of Victoria, in one state of Australia, at the arse end of the world, at the tail end of all innovation. But still it's progress. Having it there as an option once people realize the necessity of it is, I'll be happy with that. And as many people have told me, maybe I can save my keep my save the world massive deployment strategy for after the PhD. But we'll see. We'll see what's happening by the time I'm finished with all this. I suspect I'll never want to think about AI ever again. But here we are. So slow progress. This ended up going a bit longer than I originally thought. But yeah, we continue. We continue on. The literature review as a whole is now undergoing reorientation. It's there's so much to read, damn it. So I'm letting go on basically anything involving extremist groups, uh, governance and ethics for the moment. And I'm focusing entirely on the agentic AI. I need to understand how that works. I need to understand how the practicalities function. So when we start looking at these examples of how it's being applied to CVE, I'll understand how it works. So let's see. Slow progress, continue on. Mateo's away for another 3 weeks after this. So yeah, I need to have something solid for him when he gets back. And then it's 2 more months to confirmation. So yeah, making progress.